decide to do research on urban China, Gary?
Well, for me, it was a bit of an accident. I was a young faculty member at MIT, and we got a small grant from an alumnus to help us create a series of networks with architecture schools and planning schools in Asia. And so we got our faculty together and we discussed how we were going to do this, and decided what we would try to do is to create a summer program of having urban design studios in Korea and in Japan and in China. And that we would try to do them as collaborative efforts with universities in each of these places. And we decided on the universities we wanted to get involved with. And so then we went around the room, and one of my colleagues said, I'd like to do Korea. I'm interested in Korea. And another one of my colleagues said, well, I've written a book on landscape architecture in Japan, and I'd like to do more in that area. And then there was a long silence, and I assumed that my colleague Tunny Lee, who was born in China and knew quite a lot about China, would do that. And everybody looked at him, and he said, no, he said, I think it should be somebody from North America who does this. Sending a Chinese person over to learn about China was not about what we're doing. And so we went around the room, and finally they pointed at me and they said, why don't you do it? And I had never had any particular interest in China, had never been there, never really studied it, knew nothing about it. But I said, okay, let me try, and let me go over and see whether we can do something like this. And so I made a reservation to go over to visit China in 1983. And at that time, the country was really just getting back on its footing after the Cultural Revolution. And universities were very cautious about foreign entanglements because of the way the Cultural Revolution had accused many people in universities of being people that were bringing the devil into the politics of the country. But I met with people at Tsinghua University, and there were two really quite wonderful and remarkable people there. Wulang Yang, in particular, who has remained a lifelong friend, and Zhu Zhishuan, who was the head of their planning efforts, and we hit it off. And up to at that time, they had never had a foreign student study with Chinese students in the same room. The government had never allowed that to happen. And so Wulang Yang, who was a person of some stature in the country, was dean of the top architecture school, went to the government, to the Ministry of Education, and proposed that we do this. And it took the better part of a year for him to get approval of this, but he got it approved. And in 1985, I took a group of 25 students from the United States over to Tsinghua University for the summer, and they had about 15 of their students join us. And we began by looking at what the design possibilities were of parts of Beijing, and that was the beginning of a process that's gone on for 30 years, and every second year. And there have been now 300 or 400 students who have gone on these trips to China. We also spent a month traveling in China. And I never thought of it as research, except that it became clear that as we were trying to probe what was possible in terms of changes to the Chinese city, in fact, you had to learn a great deal about what the environment was for making change, what the political issues were that were involved, what the potentials were. We learned a lot about the way Chinese planning and architecture happened. We learned about public attitudes. It was just the beginning of people worrying about whether they were producing environments that people liked or didn't like. And so there was the first hopes that they might actually be able to interview people in cities on it. And from there on, we have done many projects, and that's really been the mode of research. The mode I've worked, I suppose, now in about 15 or 20 cities. We've done, after working in Beijing for a few years, we've moved on to other places, and we did that kind of a process with really talented students from Tsinghua and from the US collaborating and producing proposals for those cities. Often the costs of doing it were put forward by the cities themselves because they wanted ideas about what they should be doing. And so that's been the process that I've done over these years since then.
And you, Tim, when do you start to work on urban China? And why? Where is Tim?
Maybe his.
There we go. Sorry, it took a minute to unmute. Yeah, you know, like Gary, I started working in China in the early 1980s. But I started out my work in the countryside, in villages. My PhD work was on rural tourism development, ethnic tourism development in the countryside, chiefly in Guizhou province in southwest China. And so I started out my interest in China very much on village society, minorities, in a region that's very peripheral, often kind of stigmatized as frontier, isolated, poor, backward, and those kinds of things. And I was really interested in how people in those parts of China defined for themselves a path toward modernity in areas that were thought of as kind of the ultimately non-modern or unmodern or traditional parts of China. And I was very interested in how modernity came to those places and how those people claimed for themselves to be modern in various ways through tourism, like putting themselves on display for tourists, was a pathway to becoming more developed and more modern. And so in a way, they had to become more traditional in order to be modern. And I've always been really interested in these kinds of paradoxes about how modernity creates and produces its own traditions as its opposite. And I was interested in how those things were playing out in these far-flung regions of China. But the thing about China and the amount of change that goes on there is if you're working in rural areas and if you stay in one place long enough, it's going to become urban. Yeah. And so my interest in urban and my work in urban China really emerged from the urban coming to me rather than me going to it and deciding that, well, I really better start to understand urbanization in more systematic ways than I had. And one of the things that was part of that was the urbanization was coming to define what was possible in terms of development, in terms of improvement of livelihoods and life chances for opportunities and everything like that. It gradually came to be that all of those ideas about development started to become wrapped up in the idea of urbanization. And that was something new. You know, for a long time, rural development and development in China was about improving the countryside as a rural economy, as a rural community. And around the early 2000s, 2010s, this conversation and the discourse really shifted towards the urban being the kind of the primary, we could even say hegemonic way in which people imagined what a better future looked like. Everything became wrapped up in urban. So I also became really interested in the urban as not just a site of research and a physical place, but as an idea, as a metaphor and as an ideology.
Yeah.
And so I started looking at how that was shaping development in some of the small towns and cities, small cities and towns that were nearby the areas that I was most familiar with in terms of the work that I was doing. I started looking at how those cities were redesigning their public spaces around leisure and consumption practices, where, you know, and I was really interested in how the city was shifting from a side of industrialization, which is what it had been under socialism and under Mao. You know, the city was viewed as just a byproduct of industrialization, and industry was what really mattered. And there was a real shift from that to cities as sites of consumption, as sites of leisure, and I was curious about how that was affecting design and public space and those kinds of things. And eventually that led to my interest in infrastructure, which is what I've been doing a lot recently. And that has kind of taken me back to the countryside in some ways, because of course the countryside has really been, you know, fundamentally transformed by a lot of the infrastructure development, the high-speed rail, the expressways, and those kinds of things. And I've been looking at those as urban spaces that have kind of extended into the countryside and really transformed the countryside as a space of urbanization.
Yes, I guess that for sure in China it's difficult to identify to study the rural areas without consider urban spaces and the relationship and
there's very much this
intersection between urban and rural, but we arrive at this point. I'm quite curious if you have encountered some difficulties to work in urban and in rural China. Some difficulties to do your work, some difficulties with political power, some kind of other issue that is important to know when starting to work in China. Do you have some remark about that, Gary, or not?
Well, there's always been a difficulty of information. I mean, information is not in the public domain to the extent that it is in the West, and so you always have to have connections with somebody who has an insider view of what's happening, because the politics of decision making, the covered up aspects of the political system are going to, in the end, assert themselves, and so that's always an issue. Fortunately, in most cases where we have done projects in cities, we've been working with deputy mayors for development or other people like that who are willing to share some of the realities that they're facing in those places and give us access to information that you wouldn't get if you just arrived there and knocked on their doors on it. But there are other things that are actually equally difficult. Over the 35 years that I've been going there, I suppose it's 35 now, the country has been constantly changing. Every year it's different. And every year new things get added. Every year it evolves. And so if you think that you're designing cities so that they're going to work for people not just next year, but 10 years from now and 20 years from now, the ability to predict what the social system is going to be over that time is really, really difficult. I mean, it swings as a result of changing national government policies. It also swings in terms of the consumption patterns of Chinese people and what they're trying to emulate, and the educations that are being given to young people and what they want to accomplish, and so it's always very difficult to make predictions about which way the city is likely to, the occupants of cities are likely to swing on these kinds of things. And in a very practical way, for example, it's really hard to figure out what markets there are for things. In China, everybody knows about the ghost towns and the ghost communities, et cetera, where they've gone ahead and built things without any real market analysis of what is likely to be occupied. In many cases, they've sat empty for many, many years as a result of that. Some cases, they've totally missed the mark. That is, they've built things which will never be occupied and now have to be redesigned as a result of that. But that's because there just simply is no public information system. There are not market consultants who are helping people figure out what they should build and what they shouldn't build. It's being driven by other kinds of forces, like mayors of municipalities who want to, court favor with the higher levels of government, like banks that want to place their money in places where they probably shouldn't be putting their money, and so on and so on. And so there's a lot of uncertainty in everything one does in China. One result of that is that a lot of stuff that's planned never gets built. Happens in the US too, but it happens a lot in China.
Okay. And you, Tim, do you face any specific difficulties or other problem working in China? Maybe in rural areas at the beginning was not so easy to enter in contact with people and something like that. I don't know.
There we go. Sorry, every time I mute, I can't unmute again. Actually, it's interesting, since I've been working in both urban and rural areas. So first of all, I should say that, my work is grounded ethnographic work. It takes a long time to, often over repeated visits in the same places and with the same people, to build trust and to build a kind of a rapport. And that's why I've continued to work in the same corner of China for so many years. But I have found that that kind of work in rural areas is much easier, just because of the pace of rural life and the general openness of rural people to visitors, and to people who might be interested in talking to them about their lives. And that even goes for local officials in rural areas as well. And so it was kind of interesting when I started shifting to more urban focused work, that I found access to the field, so to speak, much more difficult, much more challenging. And that was in part because I think urban officials that we wanted to meet with and talk to were far more difficult to just get a chance to meet, because they had busy jobs and they have schedules and it's difficult to find time. Whereas in the countryside, people often, you can, even if people are working, you can work side by side and talk to them and do these kinds of things, and it's relatively easy. But that was really a challenge. But the other thing that was challenges, as I started doing more urban work, that work also corresponded with the establishment of Xi Jinping's new administration, and a real shift in attitudes, or at least guardedness or being more careful among local officials in how they responded to foreign researchers. Even foreign researchers like myself, or someone like Gary, who was closely connected with the local university or local colleagues, as we always have been. A lot of local officials were very, I wouldn't say distrustful, but wary of meeting with us, with talking with us, not so much because they were worried about us and what we were doing, but they just didn't want to create any opportunity for their superiors to consider anything that they were doing as somehow problematic. And no one was really sure, because with the anti-corruption campaign that was starting to kind of go on in 2013, 2014, 2015, there was a lot of difficulty. So I've found that over the past 5, 6, 7 years, access has become much, much more challenging. And then obviously this past year, there's been no access at all. But I find it interesting that I think people might have thought that, well, rural areas are difficult to work in because the conditions are hard and you've got to stay in the village. But I've always found rural areas much easier than urban areas. And I think that's interesting. And I don't know if that's true beyond China or not, but it's certainly true for me in China.
Yeah, but I think that also for us, the help from the Tsinghua University was really important, because if not, it's really challenging to have the chance to meet a local official or to visit some part of the city and something like that. So now I would like to ask two questions at Gary and two questions at Tim, starting from the chapters that they wrote for our catalogs, and try to be more focused on your different approaches. That Gary is an urban designer, while Tim is a geographer. For Gary, in the chapter you wrote, you describe the urbanization process in China, and I ask you if you can explain to us the different waves of Chinese urbanization, the different features, and the main places that can help us to exemplify this different period of urbanization of China.
Well, first of all, it's a big and complicated country, and so it's hard to make generalizations for the entire situation. When I began working in China, all of the enterprises in the country were state-owned, and all the development that occurred was through some public entity that was created, or a corporation that was owned by the government who was doing it. And so the resources to develop cities came almost entirely from the national government, and to the provincial governments, or to the national cities, which are essentially provinces in the country. And then it was doled out among the enterprises in those cities, and then the development actually was occurred by government companies building things and being paid for it out of these funds that were finding their way there. So the first big shift in development in the country was the development of the special economic zones. And when I went to Shenzhen the first time in 1983, I believe, or 85, there was one factory there, and there was a little row of houses that they'd built along the edge of the water for the foreign workers, that managers that they had imported to run the factory. That was Shenzhen. The rest of it was farmers and fields and all the rest of this. Today, of course, there are 13 million people there. And that happened through the creation of this special entity, basically, that received a great deal of public money to allow it to build infrastructure and create sites for developments. But much of the building that occurred there was through offshore money that came from Hong Kong, Taiwan, other countries in the world, Singapore, and was built, and then ultimately the buildings were sold to pension funds in the West and other kinds of places like that. So private capital was used to build much of the country, and certainly all of the factories and all the rest of it. Although enormous amounts were spent on infrastructure. That started in the 1980s. It really accelerated. I remember sometime toward the end of the 1980s going up the tallest building in the country, which was 50 stories. And I went back a year or two ago to see if I could see that building, see if it still was there, and it was there, but it was very hard to find because everything was taller than it today on it. So, and those special economic zones occurred in a number of countries, and then a number of special development zones got created in the urban areas. So a city like Shanghai undertook the development of Pudong as a new capital. I remember the people who were going to develop Pudong came to visit us at MIT, and they sat down around the table with us and they said, "What should be in a CBD?" And I was sort of baffled because, in the West, we don't think that you make CBDs. CBDs evolve, out of the, accumulated demand of people that are in factories and doing other kinds of things, et cetera. And so we told them what we thought about it, and we thought it was kind of a fool's errand that they were on to come and figure out what the program for a CBD should be. Well, they went there, and I visited it when it was a pig farm, and I looked at a model for this thing and never believed it would happen, but it did. And so these large-scale municipal entities that were created to do the infrastructure, much as they did in Shenzhen, and attract private businesses that invested their monies in these places, et cetera, et cetera. And gradually, this mode of development began to find its way into cities all over the country. A lot of the initial development was for infill developments, factories that were, had too much land and wanted to capitalize on some of their land resources and were building things. And then the big change really occurred around the year 2000 or somewhere in that vicinity, when they essentially asked all of the state-owned enterprises to be self-sufficient. They would get no more subsidies from the state. Well, they looked around, and there's no way that they could exist without other sources of revenue on it. And the biggest source of revenue that the very large businesses had, enterprises had, was land that was underutilized, that they could plan and make available to private developers and essentially sell the leases to them and use that to subsidize the enterprise's business. And so in cities like Beijing, many of the older districts of the city had many factories that were consolidated, and they made room for development, and so the private developers came in and did that on it. There was also a shift that occurred, which was a really, really important shift, and that was that the costs of rapidly expanding urban areas, which are drawing people in from the countryside for the new businesses and enterprises that were being created in them, meant that the local governments couldn't afford to keep up their infrastructure and build new infrastructure, et cetera. And today, or at least I shouldn't say today, a few years ago when I last looked at this, something like 70% of all of the revenues of local governments came from leasing land. And once you've leased the land, you can't lease it the next year again. I mean, they prepay the leases. And so the next year you had to lease even more land because you had even more streets to take care of, more people to take care of, et cetera. And so this became a kind of Ponzi scheme in which the local governments had to keep developing in order to be able to stay solvent. And that was one of the great drivers of development. And that actually explains why a lot of the very large-scale new towns and new developments have been developed in second-tier cities in the country, because they too need to attract new development that will come there. Finally, the last thing I'll say is that because this was private development that they were seeking, the whole attitude towards the planning and design of development changed. They needed things which had high iconic value, things that could attract people. And so every one of these large-scale new developments that was built has a lake at the center of it. Even in places like in Lanzhou, which is basically a high desert. There isn't much water there at all. They have a lake in the center of it. On it, most of them have convention centers that the government's built so that they could draw people to this place and market all the potentials that they had for new development, and so on. And so the architecture became much more assertive. The uses that were there intended came as promotional ventures largely, and so the whole attitude towards the development of the very new districts of cities was rooted in all of that.
Yes, but now, according to your experience, which could be the main issue for a designer in Chinese city?
Well, I think if the last generation was the generation of building new towns, my sense is that the next generation is going to be that of creating new districts, not whole cities. One of the problems with creating a new town is that you assume it has to have a CBD. Mm-hmm. And so when you build all these office buildings, as they did in Tianjin and the Binhai New Center, and find nobody wants office space, you have to begin thinking about this differently. You have to think about what there is a demand for and how you can, in fact, create uniquely attractive areas of cities that will draw people to live there, draw people to invest in them, but which isn't built on the notion that they're building a whole new town from scratch. And so I've argued that districts are the future. And some cities are doing it. For example, there's a really terrific, for example, in Beijing, the former Shogang steel complex, which was the big new town that was built in the 1950s in China to prove that Beijing was not just a government and bureaucrat city and academic city, but it was a place where people worked, is now being redeployed completely as a mixed use area with living, working places, offices, recreation spaces. They're building part of the Winter Olympic sites there, and the major tenant for the first use of the office buildings was that, and so on. But that'll be a district. That won't be a new town that they're doing, even though it's very large. Excuse me. One of my favorite places in China is actually in Western China, where there is a district that, in fact, throughout much of China, arts districts have become very important new places, and they have had a very particular character to it. And they're not just for the arts, but they're for creative professionals, and they're not intending to be a whole new freestanding town that serves the city that they're part of. They're often on industrial sites that have been abandoned, and that's Chongqing has several of them as an example, and so I think these are these are the future in Chinese cities, is to differentiate the areas that they're building them around new functions of the city and new both consumption and also new production functions.
In our case study, there is Tongzhou. Tongzhou is a district of Beijing. Indeed, it's called New Town. And we find it really difficult to understand yes, we know the general difference between new town, new district, new area, but on the ground, it's very hard to find the difference. Also because, for example, in Tongzhou, there is a CBD, there is all the symbolic value of building. So I think that what do you speak about is a sort of evolution and thinking a more precise work in a smaller part and not to a big idea on an entire new city to be defined from scratch.
Guangzhou is a bit of a special case because
Yes.
they're really, it has several different functions, several different kinds of districts as part of it. In fact, including one very good arts district that's there. But it's also the new, essentially regional headquarters for the metropolis, and so that's a very special kind of function that you only have one of in the region. And as they're trying to consolidate the Tianjin and the county and Beijing into one urbanized area, they had to essentially build a new location in the county that's going to be the essentially the regional government for that region on it as well. But that'll be its special character, and it'll have uses that relate to that. It won't be a big center of consumption. It'll be something different.
Okay.
I just wanted to add to Gary's story about the CBD. You know, in the new area that I've been spending time in Guizhou, the Gui'an new area, they told me that they said, well, we've learned our lesson. We're not going to have a CBD. We're going to have a CRD. And I said, what's that? And that's a Central Recreation District.
Yes.
Yes, but I guess that all the city, different level and importance in China want their CBD. All of them want the CBD, want something like that. It's a sort of symbol of modernity, of change, of something like that. But I would like to ask a team about this relationship between rural and urban, because it's one of the main issues facing probably China today. And in the text you wrote for our catalog, you suggest to change the point of view and to look at the city from the villages, to look at the city from rural areas, from a somehow defined outside. Can you explain more this move? Because seems to me that is a way to the center, in some way or another, the inherited approaches to the urban real that are more city-centric.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, as I pointed out in my initial comments, you know, I've always kind of looked at China as a whole from the outside in, from the edges, from the peripheries. I've always found that looking at China from the frontiers of China is really revealing in certain ways that you don't see things from the center. And so I suppose in terms of looking at cities from the countryside, it's a similar kind of perspective that I've always been pursuing. It seems to me that that in the urbanizing countryside, that it's there that the ideological dimensions of urbanization are most clear. That is, you know, the urban as promoted as a space of progress, of modernity, of civility, and most importantly, stability. Those aspects of what the urban means are really articulated very clearly when you're looking at how the urban is being promoted as a resource for development in the countryside. And there's several ways to understand this. One is to notice that as urbanization increases, nostalgia for the rural also increases. And so the village gets transformed into a kind of unurban space. And this transformation is itself part of the process of urbanization. You know, similar to, in broader or more abstract terms, I guess, similar to the way that modernity produces its opposite in tradition. I find that villages are being actively transformed into the opposite of the urban, and that in itself is a process of urbanization. It seems a little paradoxical, but again, that's kind of the odd way that I tend to look at these things. So this unurban space is the Beautified Village, the Meili Jiangzun. It's a space that has been designed aesthetically, visually to match a kind of an urban-oriented vision of what the countryside should look like. But this isn't just a visual process, it's also economic in terms of the ways that the countryside gets enrolled into urban space. Since these villages are transformed into leisure and recreation resorts for urban folks to visit and enjoy. That's largely what's going on in these beautified villages, villages that have been kind of given a facelift, so to speak, and refurbished. And you know, they often become kind of tourist destinations. So the idea of the Beautified Village emerges initially with the campaign to build a new socialist countryside around the early 2000s. And it was included as one of the pillars of this campaign as an effort to tidy up the village environment, with the idea being that if villagers spruced up their living spaces, they themselves would become spruced up, right? This was a way of improving the quality of the rural people themselves, as if they took better care of their rural environment. That was kind of the idea that was underlying what eventually became the Beautified Village. And there are other aspects to this as well. Tidying up villages was seen as an effort to revive a more collective or socialist sensibility following several decades of increased individualized approaches to rural economic activity and the kind of subsequent decline in the village as a viable community, particularly with so many people migrating out of the village to the cities. And so tidying up and cleaning up the village was seen as a way to kind of re-socialize the village in some ways. So, you know, for example, if we can think of public spaces in villages as lanes and walkways and those kinds of things, a lot of those had been taken over by individual households as they expanded their pig stalls or their chickens or something like that. And so there was a concern that, you know, the collective space of the village was being appropriated for privatized uses, and that tidying up the village would be a way to kind of reverse that trend. A more direct kind of economic aspect of it was actually the idea that the villagers would need to take a certain amount of financial responsibility for village beautification, would need to take out loans, and that the need to repay them or the financial obligation to do that would kind of compel them to enter into the commercial economy more directly than they might have otherwise. So all of these factors were ways in which not only the village would appear more like a village for the kind of visual and recreational consumption of urban people, but also a way of kind of integrating the village economy into a more urban-based economy, spatial economy. So, yeah, sorry.
No, please, sorry.
Yeah, just a couple other things. I mean, another way to understand the importance of the village for looking at urbanization is to think about the way the village has become enrolled in an urban-based infrastructure grid or network. And this is something that I've been looking at more recently. So part of this is just the huge changes in transportation infrastructure that have been going on in a place like Guizhou with high-speed rail and expressways, you know, big highways. And Guizhou is a place that is very rugged. It's all mountains, and you know, it's been a very difficult place to get from one place to another because you go over all these mountains. These new highways and high-speed rails just go straight through the mountains and straight over the valleys on bridges and tunnels. It's basically you're either on a bridge or in a tunnel when you're traveling there now. But the time that it takes to get from one place to another now has radically changed. I you know, back in the 90s when I was doing my dissertation field work, for example, it took 2 to 3 days to get to the field sites from the provincial capital that I worked in. And some of those sites are now accessible with a 45-minute train ride or even a half an hour. And so that just completely changes the disposition of that village towards urban populations. People can go to the village for a few hours for a picnic and then come back. And that has made those villages connected to urban space in fundamentally new ways and oriented them towards the urban in ways that they hadn't before. And so you can see how the urban is viewed and how it's understood from these perspectives, because these places are so much more connected now than they were. And then finally, the only other thing I'll add to that connection is there's also kind of soft digital infrastructures, broadband, fiber optic cables, wireless connectivity, those kinds of things that are also connecting villages to cities in fundamental ways. And so now you have this rise in the phenomenon of the Taobao village, for example, villages that have kind of turned themselves over to kind of the actual human labor of processing e-commerce orders, for example. So Alibaba, for example, has become a primary rural development actor in China because it's able to link these villages into this huge kind of urban-based network of supply chains. And that's also, so looking at the villages from that perspective also tells you an awful lot about what's been going on with urbanization in some ways that you might not appreciate otherwise.
Yes, I completely agree with you. And yes, I think that China is very interesting to look at this point, because rural and urban are institutional categories defined by the state, while the infrastructure development, the social economic dynamics completely challenging this straight distinction between urban area and rural areas. So it's interesting to look at the intersection, and I think that this is a very traditional point of attention for urban scholars, for geographers that look at the relationship between urban and rural. But I guess that in China today, this relationship, this issue is put in a more radical way, challenging all, maybe not all, but a lot of categories we have to try to understand something. What do you think about that? In which way we can try to manage to understand this completely reorganization of the space, in which is difficult to say, well, this is rural, this is urban. Also, if there is this box that say, well, this is urban land, this is rural land, but the everyday life and the socioeconomic dynamics completely challenge this organization.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it's one that I've been thinking a lot about. I mean, I think on the ground, what you say is true, that the landscape and the functions of what actually is happening is difficult to categorize as rural or urban, and really blurs those distinctions. But at the same time, the idea of the city as a special kind of space, as a different kind of space, is still very, very powerful in China. And I hope Gary's right that we're shifting from a new town to a new district kind of paradigm. But in places where I work, the new town is still very much viewed by local officials as the paragon of development, right? It's what everybody wants to see, is a shiny new city with shiny buildings, a CBD, all those things that represent symbolically everything that people are working so hard to achieve. And so nobody wants to live in this kind of muddled space that's not urban or not rural, and nobody knows what it is. And yet, you're right, that's the kind of spaces that's being produced. I mean, I've, thinking about I can offer a couple ideas that help kind of illustrate what's going on, I think. One is to look at so for example, the National New Type Urbanization Plan, which was formulated as part of the 13th five-year plan, 2016 to 2020. It's the first urbanization plan that China's ever actually had, first plan specifically devoted to urbanization. And it's interesting because if you look at the title itself, for example, in Chinese, urbanization, the term urbanization is typically rendered as 城市化, which literally means cityization, right? But in the New Type Urbanization Plan, the term urbanization is rendered as 城镇化, which literally means city and townization. With the town being put in there, zhen, a zhen is the lowest kind of non-agricultural administrative division in China. And what this means is the urbanization plan deliberately is focusing on promoting urbanization all through the different administrative levels throughout the hierarchy. It's an urbanization plan that deliberately seeks to draw emphasis away from large cities, the large, and spread urbanization out into other districts, the interior, smaller towns, those kinds of things, so that, like you say, you have this kind of a broader kind of network, a more horizontal form of urbanization going on, rather than clustering in just the largest cities. It's a plan that wants to put the urban within everyone's reach, basically, no matter where they are in the country, and that's having an effect of kind of creating these spaces that even if they don't really look urban, they could be thought of as urban in many ways. I'm kind of, I'm reminded of Henri Lefebvre's idea of urbanization as something that, even if it's not where you're looking, it's virtually there anyway. And so that's kind of what this plan has really been producing in China. Another key issue has been the change in China's urban planning law. So this is a law that was initially came out in the 1990s, I believe, around 1990. In 2007, it was revised to become the urban and rural planning law. And this meant that villages, for the first time, had to have a kind of a 20-year master plan. Local governments had to hire urban planners. And many of these urban planners didn't really know anything about the rural economies, and they started designing urban plans that were very urban plans that were just meant to kind of be for villages. And one of the things that when this was starting to first roll out, the result was often a shift from the village as a kind of a horizontal space to a village with a more vertical orientation. This was supposed to rationalize rural settlements to save arable land space. It was supposed to reduce the village footprint, sometimes by as much as 30 to 40%. And then there was actually some backlash that resulted from this, because people started to complain that the villages were starting to look like concrete forests, is how they would put it, like miniature cities popping up all over the countryside. And people began to think, we want a countryside that looks like the countryside. And this later on became a new rural development buzzword, that the countryside should look like the countryside and not like a city, even as the countryside becomes increasingly integrated into the city with all these infrastructures and things that I was talking about earlier. And all of that has kind of become wrapped up now in what we call urban and rural integration, which is the major development buzzword these days, I think, for rural China. There's been a lot of pilot projects in places like Chongqing and Chengdu, emphasizing how to spur industrial and economic development in the countryside without crossing the red line of China's 124 million hectares that need to be preserved as arable land. But a lot of scholars have pointed out that the outcome of all of this has been a significant increase in state control of rural land. And that's also an important aspect of urbanization in China. So as you have that increased state control, these landscapes increasingly, resemble something that's not quite rural and not quite urban. Because of course, the rural land was, there's a divide in that, that has been in place in China for a long time, where rural land is controlled by rural collectives, urban land is controlled by the state. That's part of the, well, there's a lot of dimensions to that, as state control over rural land becomes increasingly present as part of the urban-rural integration, those spaces no longer are autonomously controlled by rural collectives, and that has also changed the character of those spaces.
Yes, of course. Okay, so thank you so much. I ask at the audience if there are some questions. I know that the students want to ask some question at our guest. So please open your mic and your camera, and
but no singing.
We want to see.
I said no singing.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay.
Harry.
Yes.
Can you open your camera, please?
I'm not able. I don't know the host.
Okay. Vabbè.
Can you hear me?
What's a pity?
Ah, no, it's okay.
Okay.
Okay, so thank you for this presentation, for this discussion, actually. So my question is, China has followed the steps of the Western part of the world. And so my question actually poses on the individuality that China is maybe trying or may try to vie for in the future. So in your opinion, my question is for both of you, how would the Chinese or foreign urban planners tackle the issue of maintaining the identity, especially that now in the rural areas, it's also being ravaged by the urbanization? Thank you.
Well, let me start. First of all, we should be a little cautious about whose aspiration it is to make this something different from international urban development. In fact, my impression is that a very large fraction of the Chinese population, particularly in urban areas, wants stuff that they see in other parts of the world in their cities, and it's a bit this, in many cases it's a kind of nostalgic notion that we should not be copying stuff from elsewhere in the world because that would somehow dilute the Chinese-ness of urban areas on it. In fact, it's interesting that most of the Western architects who worked in China have been able to do things in China that they couldn't do anywhere else in the world. That is, they've designed buildings that were far more extravagant, mixed uses that were far more mixed. They've created in some cases, new forms of leasing of buildings, room by room, rather than by floor, as they do in other places, which results in a very different kind of form of a building, and so on and so on. And so I wouldn't say that building cities with a Chinese character is the aspiration of most of the people who are living in cities in China today. There are certainly traditional areas of those cities with housing of more traditional forms that people like to live in, but so they like that in New York too, and they like that in San Francisco, and they like that in Singapore as well. So it's very hard say we should just be kind of emulating historical patterns of development. What is clear is that there are areas in Chinese cities that need to be redeveloped over time. And in those areas, one would hope that they wouldn't simply build the kind of massive high-rise developments that they've been building over the last few years for people to live in. And in fact, there are a few places in the country where they're experimenting with much more modular forms of development. So, for example, the University Avenue area in Shanghai, which is a new area of live-work residences, which they've created, which is really quite terrific. And it's being done block by block. It's not being done as a massive development over the whole area. There are several developers providing different kinds of housing in it, and the individual and the shops and restaurants are being leased individually by each building, and there are a series of things like that that are going on, which are great experiments to change the form of development that has been the custom over the last few years into something that's much more urban, in a traditional urban sense that Shanghai was. So let's not make it be just nostalgic. Let's not look for buildings that have pagoda roofs on them and other kinds of things like that, which they once thought was the way that you make things Chinese, even though many of the mayors of cities are still urging these things on the architects that are building things in their cities.
Yeah, that's all very very true. And looking at a project that I had done a little while ago was focused on these kind of county level towns in Guizhou. And Guizhou, you have to kind of understand, is a place with a lot of ethnic minority people. And so for a while, there was this big push to redesign or transform these townscapes into ethnic looking facade, give them these very ethnic looking facades on the buildings. So they took what had previously just been unexceptional cement block buildings that were the typical building that you found in these county towns all over China, and they would give them a facelift and give them kind of make the buildings look like a big village house, and put little ornamentations on the outsides and things like this. And they felt that because so many tourists were coming to this region to visit the ethnic villages, they felt that towns should look like this as well. And that this was also be kind of a place-based brand that these towns could really build on as a kind of a unique identity, not only beyond China, but specifically for Chinese tourists themselves who might want a different kind of landscape to view. The work that we were doing was focused on talking with residents in the town and figuring out what they thought of all of this. And like Carrie says, they're like, what is this? This is crazy. We don't want to live in a town that looks like a village. That's why we live in the town. And they would say, look at Pudong, look at the skyline in Shanghai. That's what we want our town to look like. We want to look like a global modern town. We don't want to look like this backward old village. And they were very, a lot of them were really quite upset about this. And so, to them, the idea of urbanization was very much about looking as much as possible like all the other cities around the world. And that was the end goal. I mean, that was why that was what progress was about. I mean, the other thing that I'll also just mention is a little bit of historical perspective or historical time is really important here. For a while, when I first started going to China, the dominant kind of building form were these, just concrete block buildings. And certainly in many of the towns around China, this was what was built, and completely functional, no particular interesting design or anything. And we thought of them as just these kind of socialist buildings. And and as reforms started to get going and urbanization started to get going, and the architects that Gary's talking about began to be hired and change the urban landscape, these kinds of old buildings disappeared very quickly. And now there's, recently there's been quite a strong heritage movement to try and preserve the few that remain, as a kind of a record of a particular era of socialist kind of collective urban living, which has disappeared now because everyone lives in a private apartment block, some apartment tower. And so no one would have ever thought that people would have any interest in preserving these concrete 5-floor rectangles that used to dominate the urban fabric. But now there's a strong movement to try and preserve this. So one era's landscape of sameness becomes the next era's landscape of heritage.
Thank you for these answers. Very interesting.
Okay, I think that there is Zainab and Joel. It's correct. And maybe you can do the 2 questions and then we can finish our conversation because, okay, please, Zainab.
Good afternoon. Thank you for this interesting lecture. We prepared a few questions, but I think now we're just going to limit ourselves to one. My question is regarding the hukou system, which classified households based on the place of residence. And we feel that it has, the truth is, it has a direct relationship with the fact that a Chinese person is either an agricultural or rural hukou holder, or a non-agricultural, or in other words, an urban hukou holder. How was the system affected with this new urbanization and this diffusion or absence of a clear distinction between what once was rural and now is kind of both? Thank you.
Well, maybe I'll start and talk about it from the urban standpoint. Excuse me. The hukou system is actually a result of a serious financial problem that they have in China, which is that the large urban areas have needed many more employees in order to build the buildings and run the restaurants and do all of the service jobs in the city, but they don't have the resources to provide the services for them. And so people migrate in from the countryside and they work in the cities, but they don't get any services. Their children don't, if they bring their families in, their children don't have any schools. The hospitals can't serve don't have the capacity to serve all of the people who are in the city, and so on. They just simply, and they also, the city doesn't have the opportunity or really the resources to provide the kind of housing for them. They're left to occupy privately owned housing, basically on leases, very poor quality housing. The city can't really provide resources for them. Why can't they? Well, they have no taxes in the cities, basically, no local taxes. They have taxes on businesses, but they're a very small portion of it. And so they have to depend on the national government giving them money to be able to provide these kinds of services. I've spoken to a lot of people about it in the cities, and they said, if the national government gave us the resources to provide services to these people, we would be quite happy to give them hukous. We'd be happy to have them as permanent residents, but we can't on it. Of course, their pressures on the national government are also from the rural areas who don't want to give up all those people and yet have to, if they're on demand, to provide them with services if they come out there and have illnesses and have to be treated, or if they leave their children behind with their grandparents in those communities and so on. This has got to be solved, at some point. And because many people have lived their entire lives in urban areas and never been permanent residents of those urban areas. There are some ways to get a hukao if you have a company sponsor you and other such things, but usually they're mostly for higher educated people go through universities and want to stay in a city or move to a city and so on it. So I think it's a really big problem. And it's a problem that's at its root a financial problem of cities not having the resources to be able to deal with it.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple additional perspectives to that. I mean, one is in terms of shaping kind of the landscapes of urbanization. The hukou system has had a profound effect, right, of shaping how cities have developed over time. I mean, for example, in the South, in the Pearl River Delta area, where you had urbanization going on, you had a lot of migrants coming to that area, right, with rural hukou, looking for jobs, looking for opportunities. But you also had villages in those areas, in those urbanizing areas, that maintained their rural control over the village, a lot of the land actually got transferred over to urban and industrial uses, but the villages themselves, where the village houses were, remained rural land. All those rural hukou migrants coming in would the villagers who owned those village houses would turn those houses into apartments or something to house all these migrants coming in. These were not officially kind of urban spaces owned by or controlled by the municipal government. They were still controlled by the village collective. And they provided an important kind of space of entry for rural migrants coming into the city that otherwise would not have been available. And what Gary says is absolutely right. Growing cities didn't have the resources to meet the needs of a lot of the labor coming in. But in some of those cases, those needs were met by these villages that were kind of became villages in the city. And in Chinese, there's a term "chengzhongcun" that refers to this phenomenon. And it's a really fascinating, kind of very unique aspect of urbanization in China that is there because of the functional kind of nature of the hukou system. The other thing I would just add is that one of the things that they've been trying to do with this new type urbanization plan that I was talking about earlier is in order to try to kind of stem the migration flows to the largest cities, where they don't want to focus on a lot of the urban growth, but they do want to focus on urbanization in the smaller towns. So the plan, it contains directives, guidance for local governments in those smaller, lower tier cities to be able to transfer rural hukous to urban hukous. And so the government is actually trying to encourage more of those transfers at those lower tiers in order to kind of reduce the pressure of people who would rather have a Beijing hukou or a Shanghai hukou or something like that. Say, well, you can't have that, but we'll give you a hukou to this little, district town or county level town, no problem. And everyone's like, well, we don't, there's no economic opportunity there. So this is it's a strategy. They're trying to use the hukou system to redirect urbanization in a way that that they hope will create a more level, less large city focused pattern. But I think Gary's right that it's going to take more than that to reduce the desire that people have to go to those largest cities, because obviously that's where the largest economic opportunities are.
Okay, thank you. And then there is the last question by Joelle.
Good afternoon. Thank you for this very interesting conversation. So I would like to ask about the interplay between politics and policies that shape the urban and rural infrastructures, and infrastructures that shift the politics in the Chinese cities. And so my questions are, how do geopolitics in a certain area affect infrastructure and urban development and change in the mentioned Chinese cities, like the management, resource efficiency, etc.? And in turn, does the making of these new infrastructures affect the discourse of governance in a specific area?
Well, first of all, infrastructure is actually provided at different levels in China. The national government has a number of programs like the high-speed rail programs. The provincial governments have other roadway and other kinds of infrastructure that they take care of, parks as well on it. And then the municipal governments have all streets and other kinds of things that are there. I think that Tim pointed out earlier that the high-speed rail systems had a profound impact in terms of the linkages between places in China and the ability of people, an hour distant from the city by rail to be able to attract businesses and other kinds of uses in those places. I did a little count one time about the high-speed rail system, and it looked to me like there were about 1,300 high-speed rail stations in China, 1,300 of them, and many of those are in urban areas, but many of them are not. Many of them are in agricultural areas, and and every one of those agricultural areas where they're located in thinks that they could actually attract development to them. And so every one of them is planning up a storm in terms of what they're going to do to attract them. Actually, one of the most creative things I saw recently was I was on a jury for a competition in a city about an hour out of Beijing by rail, high-speed rail, who was wanting to create a new center for that part of the county, for their townships in that part of the county, and one of the entries that was provided, and most of them they don't ever get programs for these things, so the architects have to invent the programs, and so most of the architects had high buildings and the usual CBD kind of development in these areas, which is what I think probably the local officials said that they wanted on it. One of the entries, excuse me, which we ultimately gave the first prize to, said, look, that's crazy. Why don't we focus on agriculture in this town? And why don't we make all of the aspects of agriculture, try to attract the businesses that feed them to this place? And what does that mean? That means companies that manufacture agricultural equipment. That means businesses that create seeds for agriculture, fertilizers, all of these things. And then they proposed also that the center of the town be given over to agriculture instead of a huge plaza, that they would usually have in a big park with lakes and other things like that they would usually have. They said, let's have high-tech agriculture in the center of the city, greenhouses, all kinds of forms of production that are set a model for this kind of stuff. And, it seems to me those kinds of innovations are the sort of thing that we would hope would start occurring in some of those over 1,000 rural stops on the high-speed rail line.
It's a really interesting question to me for a couple of reasons. I mean, I'll go back to the high-speed rail issue that Gary was just talking about, but approach it a little differently because your question you asked about politics. One of the Gary's right that have all these different levels of infrastructure, right? And those are different levels of governance and different levels of municipal administration and those kinds of things. And one of the political issues going on here is that and the new towns are a real interesting aspect of this, and that is the power of municipal governments in China. And the relative autonomy of that, in terms of that power vis-a-vis the national government. And And there's always a bit of a tension and a interplay going on here. And one of the things with the high-speed rail is, of course, that is a national level project that seeks to, in some ways, wrest control of infrastructure developments away from the municipal governments and towards the central government, because they feel that a lot of municipal government initiated projects are great, but they focus on the interests of that municipal space, and that there's a lot of inefficiency and problems on a national scale of how these projects all fit together. The high-speed rail project is along with these national new areas, like the one that I've been looking at in Guizhou the Guojia Xinchu development. These are ways in which a new scale of governance can be created that can diffuse a little bit of that municipal government power and allow the central government to kind of wrest some of that control over infrastructure development away from municipalities. And so new areas are part of that governance project, and the high-speed rails that link them together are part of that. The issue of where the location of high-speed rail stations is really interesting in this regard. I mean, people have been looking at, for example, the fact that, one of the jokes that people make in China about high-speed rail is it takes longer to get from your home to the high-speed rail station than it does to get wherever you're going on the high-speed rail. And that's often because the high-speed rail station is located on the outskirts of the city. And Gary's right. I mean, there are all these rural stations as well, of course, but the main terminal stations, the Shenzhen station, the Guangzhou station, these are often located on the outskirts of the city and can be actually quite difficult to get to or take a long time to get to. They're not right in the middle of the city. And part of the reason for that is that the municipal governments, if they're powerful enough, they want to maintain control of their urban municipal space and don't want to cede control of the land that the high-speed rail station is going to be on, or the land near the high-speed rail line. They don't want to cede that control to the central government. So they say, go ahead and put your rail station on the outskirts because we don't care as much about that land. We want to control our CBD for ourselves. And so we don't want a national rail system coming in and setting up this huge station right in the middle of the city. So so some of the interesting work has kind of actually found that there's correlation between the power of the city government and the distance of the high-speed rail station from the city center, with the most powerful city governments like Shenzhen seeing the longest distance of high-speed rail. So it's a really interesting landscape that has emerged because of these political tensions between different levels of governance in China.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Thank you both.
So I think that we can finish this very beautiful conversation. It's enough. Sorry I apologize for the problems at the beginning. Never happened, but it's the first time and it's okay. Sorry for that. Thank you so much to be here today with us. Thank you so much for this very interesting conversation, dialogues, and I hope that we have soon the possibility to see, not through a screen, but in person, and to continue our dialogues and our conversation. Thank you so much to the students to be so present and during this afternoon. So, thank you.
Well, thank you so much too for having us. And I wanted to say that you've produced, actually, I know a number of you have been involved in the book that's come out as well. And it is really a remarkable book. I mean, it's a beautiful book to start with, and it's also a pretty remarkable collection images and words about the current condition in China of urbanization. And so congratulations on producing such a wonderful thing.
Yeah, I would second that. It's a magnificent book, it really is. And I'm so happy to be part of it.
Oh, thank you so much. Maybe if you can, we wait you to visit the exhibition. The exhibition will be open until August. Maybe I don't know what's happening.
Opening in August, or is it opening in August and it'll run from there, or until August?
I don't know. We don't know when reopen, but it's closed. Is at the beginning, the last day is in February, and then is continue go ahead, because for this situation it's quite impossible to do some program and something like that. But if you can be in Turin, it will be really beautiful for us to come with you to see the exhibition. Of course, I know that it's hard, but maybe we can arrive to organize or another time for sure.
Well, let us know when it opens again, okay?
Okay, okay. Thank you so much for all. And, see you very soon.
Thank you so much again. Sorry about it means it was much hyped event.